All right. And so lastly, we'll be doing a few quick surveys throughout the session in order to better tailor the presentation to participant responses. So we're going to have a QR code and share also a use code through menti.com. So be on the lookout for that. That'll happen about 4 times throughout the presentation. All right. So before we get into the agenda, and I introduce our presenters, I'd like to introduce Monica Tang, Business Advisor Sector Capability with the ISO. Monica is going to provide a bit of an overview on the programs available through the ISO's business program and provide a little bit more information for you. So Monica, please feel free to go ahead.
Thanks, Alyssa. So on behalf of ISO, thank you for joining us. I just wanted to share that we have some initiatives and programs that are available to you and your organizations. So we have, I listed most of our programs here. We have a retrofit program, and so you would get incentives for up to 50% of your project costs. We have an instant discounts program. So this is with participating distributors for lighting projects, and there's no paperwork involved. You automatically get the discounts applied. We have an energy performance program, and that's more of a portfolio-based program where you have an automated baseline model, and any savings that you get within 2 years' time, then you would get incentives for that. We have a strategic energy program, and we're actually looking for any municipalities to join our cohort. We're launching a cohort. It's a 2-year cohort, and it's all free. And you get coaching and peer-to-peer learning for participating. And then the last one that we have is the existing building commissioning program. So this is low cost and no cost measures to help tune up your building and to save energy that way. And the last link I have in there is the training and support. So this is part of the training support program that we have. And these are all links if you're interested in learning more about these programs. Next slide, please. And if you want to chat with anybody about these programs, these are the email addresses that you can email to get more information, as well as to help you through the process if you need any assistance. That's it. Thanks, Alyssa.
Perfect. Thanks, Monica. All right. So next, we'll go through and we'll introduce today's presenters. I'm really happy to be able to introduce Emily Thorne-Corte and Robert Story of Thorne Associates. They're here today to talk about energy and emissions regulations. So Thorne Associates is a reputable consulting firm known for their expertise in sustainable energy solutions and environmental consulting. They specialize in advising businesses and organizations on implementing sustainable practices, optimizing energy usage, and navigating regulatory frameworks related to environmental compliance. They are recognized for their comprehensive approach, blending technical expertise with strategic insights to help clients achieve their sustainability goals. Their team comprises of seasoned professionals with backgrounds in engineering, environmental science, and policy. Thorne Associates works with clients across various sectors, from commercial to industrial and institutional entities. So welcome, Emily and Bob. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to take us through the session.
Thank you so much, Alyssa and Monica, and really pleased to be here with everyone. So today our objective is to help you, if everybody could please mute, is to develop familiarity with mandatory and voluntary energy and greenhouse gas reporting that's relevant to Ontario. So we'll be speaking about 4 different regulations within 2 acts on a provincial Ontario basis, but we'll also talk about some federal regulations and programs, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program and Clean Fuel Standards, and we'll wrap up with some information on financial kind of climate and energy reporting that is currently voluntary but will become mandatory for publicly traded companies in Canada. And you may have heard of the new, currently in draft, Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards, 1, which is the general requirements, and 2, which are the climate related ones. So just before I go further, please ask any questions in the chat or raise your hand. Alyssa is going to be managing that. So Alyssa, please just jump in and let me know. Also, I will be spelling out or saying, I guess, acronyms that the first time at a minimum every time they're used, but you will be receiving or able to get a copy of this slide deck after the presentation at some point, not necessarily immediately. It could be a few days, but you will get a copy of it, and the acronyms are all in the appendix. And also just to make sure everybody's familiar with the term greenhouse gas, these are gases in the Earth's atmosphere that trap heat, and greenhouse gases act like sort of glass walls of a greenhouse, hence their name, trapping heat inside, or in the Earth's case, that means trapping heat in our atmosphere. There are currently 7 greenhouse gases that are managed. Now, there used to only be 6. There has been a new one, which is nitrogen trifluoride, which is used in electronics. But the main original ones are the carbon dioxide, which I'm sure you've heard of, methane, nitrous oxide. There's a couple fluorinated gases with the fancy chemical names hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons for any chemical engineers in the audience, and sulfur hexafluoride, which is used in transformers. So anyone in the sort of electricity transmission and distribution sector should definitely know about SF6 or sulfur hexafluoride as an important greenhouse gas. Okay, so now everybody's familiar. I'm going to try and make this as not dry as possible. For if there's any lawyers, this is probably what you love. But I'm guessing that there are not very many lawyers in the audience, but we are talking about laws and regulations. So I'll try and make them come alive for you and keep it interesting. Feel free again to jump in with any questions, and we will using the Menti sort of survey to keep you engaged as well. So let's start with the Environmental Protection Act, which is under the purview of the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks within Ontario, who oversee the energy and GHG reporting requirements. And the purpose of this act is to provide the protection and conservation of the natural environment. There are actually about 50 Ontario regulations under this act. We'll be focusing on 2, which is OREG 390, which we'll get into right away, on greenhouse gas emissions quantification, reporting, and verification, and OREG 241, which is the emissions performance standard. And for those not familiar with regs, the number here after the sort of slash is the year. So that means 2018, and this one was enacted in 2019. So you kind of can tell how recent or not so recent an act is just by that. So let's dive into 390. Again, GHG emissions quantification, reporting, and verification. This requires large industrial GHG emitters and some others to report annual greenhouse gas emissions to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks if they have one of these three sort of criteria. If you import any electricity, now by importing we do not mean that you're just purchasing electricity from a distribution company or transmission company, such as like Ontario Hydro or etc. When we say import, mean that out of province. So some of you, like maybe around Cornwall, could buy from New York State or that kind of thing. So this is likely not applicable to the vast majority. If you emit more than 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, then you are required to report. And we have seen the registration list, and we know that many of you, probably most, or at least a sizable number, will be required to do that based on your emissions level. And by the way, when we talk about carbon dioxide equivalent, I'll go into it a bit later. We have a bit of a chart, but this means all of the greenhouse gases. When you see this little e, this is extremely important. And it means that it's not just carbon dioxide, but there's a way using what's called the factor global warming potential to convert all of the other greenhouse gases that we just discussed, methane, et cetera, into a carbon dioxide equivalent. So be very careful when you're looking, for any greenwashing or that, or if you're publishing your own sustainability reports, make sure that you are considering not just carbon dioxide, but all of the other greenhouse gases, and that you put this little E, because that's extremely important. So the third way that you would have to report, again, is mandatory if you're registered for the emissions performance standard regulation, which is the one we'll discuss after this. This regulation came into effect in August 2018. And now we are going to go to Menti, so to do a little poll. So Alyssa, I'll turn it over to you. I'll stop sharing. And you might be on mute, Alyssa.
Thank you. I was just testing everyone's lip reading skills. All right, so on the screen, everybody should see the QR code that we talked about at the beginning. So we'll give you a few minutes. Feel free to use the QR scanner on your device, or you can join us at menti.com and use the code 8337-6383. And that should take you directly to our first poll. Okay, so we're starting to see some people log in, so that's great. If you're on your device at home, you should see this first slide with the ability to give it a little thumbs up. So looks like we have about 14, 15 or so people coming in. So again, we'll leave it a few more seconds here, and I'll just remind everybody in the audience, feel free, as Emily mentioned, to type some questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and we will stop the presentation when it makes sense to raise your question. So looks like we have a lot of people coming in now, so we're going to go over to our first question. All right, so the first question is, does your organization have to report OREG 390? So that's the greenhouse gas quantification, reporting, and verification regulation, and we can see interactively people's responses starting to come in. So predominantly we're seeing, the majority of people do have to report it. And, this makes a lot of sense, Emily, that we're seeing a lot of don't knows. So, and I think this is one of the reasons why we're hosting this session. So you're definitely in the right place. Yeah, most people definitely have to report it or don't know, Emily. So I feel like that's useful information. Thank you to everybody for reporting. We'll be coming back to this again. So if you didn't get a chance to log in, again, you can go to menti.com. You can take note of the code, which is 8337-6383. And we'll be coming back to do a few more quizzes as we get through. So Emily, I'll hand it back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alyssa. That is very helpful information. So certainly, again, yes, you're in the right place, and don't know, you're also in the right place. If you know those couple people, well, it's good always to know, because maybe your organization might get bigger and might have to report, or you could change organizations in the future. So I am going to share again just to check, Alyssa, you can see the screen.
Yep.
Perfect.
Good, Emily.
Great. Okay. So just going on to a bit more details now on the OREG 390. So you must submit a GHG emissions report by June 1st every year. I think this was meant to say June 3rd this past year. So you probably just have done it if you had to. So if you don't know, you could maybe contact some of your colleagues in your organization and even get a copy of your latest report. Could be potentially interesting for you to know. The report needs to be submitted through the single window information manager known as SWIM reporting system of the Environment and Climate Change Canada, which accepts both federal and provincial GHG reports. So this is a great place. If you don't know about the SWIM portal, then it can be very useful for a number of different reporting. And this is just an example of a data entry to SWIM. It's, you know, more comprehensive than this, but we kind of just took this example where you can see this facility. There are different 7 greenhouse gases here. They've only filled in 3, which, by the way, are the most common: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And both the tons of each gas and then the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for here at the bottom, your facility total. This facility is at 42,000 tons. And so this is how much they report. There's something called a de minimis emissions. We'll get to that. That's for kind of very small amount of emissions can more or less be ignored. And here's your reporting amount. You'll notice a verification amount. So we'll talk about that, but certain reports do have to be externally and independently verified. So materiality, I mentioned that de minimis. To determine materiality is a very important concept in all kinds of reporting, and it's basically determining, you know, if it's material. Sometimes that's if it's for like financial stakeholders, et cetera. Is that going to inform the decision of an investor, for example? In terms of this regulation, there are some standard methods that are specified in the guide to quantify each specified GHG activity and determine if reporting is required. But in general, if the emissions from fuels do not exceed 0.5% of the total emissions from all fuels combusted, then it's a de minimis amount and does not need to be reported. And for those who have external verification, if the verifier finds a discrepancy of 5% or more, it is deemed to be a material discrepancy, and you'll likely have to take some corrective action for that. So you must be externally verified by an accredited verification body if you have over 25,000 tons of carbon dioxide. The Standards Council of Canada has a verification program that is recognized by this regulation. So you can look up Standards Council of Canada. And we'll now go to boundaries. So mainly it's just about reporting Scope 1 direct emissions. So again, some basics for those who are not familiar with Scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 1 are your direct emissions from your facility on site. So that would be if you're, for example, burning natural gas for heating, if you're driving around with gasoline or diesel company-owned cars on your site. And if you have furnaces that, you know, again, are natural gas or other fuels, those would all be Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are your purchased energy, typically electricity, but it could also be other purchased heating and cooling, such as purchased steam. And or like for those who have, for example, district energy systems and connections. And Scope 3 are your value chain emissions. So these are related to emissions from your suppliers upstream and emissions from your downstream customers. For example, it could be emissions from the purchased goods and services, so the emissions associated with if you're procuring like some, I don't know, steel, for example, for your product, then the emissions associated with the extraction of the iron ore from the ground, the processing of that into steel, and then the transportation of that steel to your company. As well as there's 15 different Scope 3 categories. Outside the scope of this training, so I won't go into it, but on high level, that's it. So we talked about the 7 different greenhouse gases, and these all need to be reported in this regulation. And I wanted to just touch on this global warming potential. You may have heard, you know, that not all of the gases have the same impact, and they don't. And you can really see a really big difference, right? So carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1. In a way, it's the least harmful. However, be careful here because it's the most prevalent. So in typical, you know, greenhouse gas inventories, aka carbon footprints that we deal with our clients, we deal with across different sectors. Bob Story has more MUSH, municipal, university, school, and hospital experience. I have more industrial. So in the industrial experience industry, then carbon dioxide typically, I would say, is in and around the 80% of total CO2e emissions. So even though it's just a 1, it is very important. Methane, though, is about 28 times. This number, by the way, kind of changes as the science changes. I've seen it start at 24, 25, 28. Anyways, I would say around 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide. And then, you know, you get into the hundreds for nitrous oxides and then to thousands. So these last two here, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons, these are used in refrigerants. And you can see tens of thousands times. I have an ethical dilemma right now where our car has, that we have an electric car and a non-electric car, and our non-electric is leaking apparently refrigerant fluid. But anyways, that's aside. So that's a very big problem. We need to deal with that. So if you have any leaky refrigerant, that you need to get that addressed very quickly because of the very high global warming potential. And Scope 2 electricity emissions are not reported in this regulation because they are reported by the electricity producers. I don't believe there are any electricity sort of generators on the call today because that's their Scope 1. But if you're sort of a normal, again, MUSH sector, institutional, or an industry, as I believe almost all participants are, then it's just your Scope 1. And, you know, you do need to consider like no double counting, you know, in terms of it's important. That's why, you know, they're just reporting your Scope 1 and then the Scope 2 by the generators. So when Canada kind of overall reports up internationally, then you want to try and ensure that there's no double counting. So that's part of the important sort of bigger picture here to track our national, this is important, this regulation, to track our national progress in the Paris Accord objectives. Okay, and just getting on to the end here for this regulation, there were some very recent amendments, if you're not aware, filed only just this April to clarify some program requirements, improve program implementation and administration, and address some changes. I'll just go through some of these key amendments to wrap up this regulation. And by the way, these there's links throughout this, hyperlinks. So in the PDF, you'll be able to access these links and can give you access to more details. So these are some of the recent amendments. So for example, your reporting amount no longer needs to include biomass produced CO2. That's separate. So that's great. There have been some changes to what's called the total annual emissions limit. We'll talk about that in the next regulation, but it basically is a limit of how much emissions you have for your facility, above which you need to start paying. And this has had a material impact, I can say, on our clients. So some of them, this has resulted in, for example, they started with paying, you know, potentially multi-million dollars per year and are now getting credit, like expecting to receive money. So we'll get into this because these are, by the way, this amendment touches both this Reg 390 and the 241, the emissions performance standard. And so these are going to be, these amendments are applicable for the 2023 compliance period, meaning the report that you hopefully just submitted on June 1st. Again, if you didn't, this is your very late wake-up call. You want to get that in ASAP to avoid, well, it might be too late, but for penalties, but you can try and see. And also there's expanding eligibility for renewable natural gas. I think that's quite positive, as well as addressing temporary shutdowns for those of you who have, you know, temporary shutdowns that can have an impact, a significant impact. So I think that was probably some industry lobbying that got addressed, which is probably justified in my opinion. Okay, Alyssa, I'll just check in here. We're finished with that first regulation. Are there any key questions that you see in the chat at this point, or should I move on to the second one?
No, we have no questions in the chat right now, Emily. So just as a reminder, if you have questions, you don't have to wait until the end, although we will be addressing questions at the very end. But as Emily switches through different regulations, it might you know, be relevant to address your questions while we're still talking about that regulation. So again, encourage everybody to use the chat as they have questions come up. Emily, are we ready for the second mentee?
Yes, absolutely. So let's go for that.
Okay. So I will just refer everybody back to our Menti quizzes. So again, if you haven't joined yet, you can go to menti.com, use code 8337-6383. We have our first quiz that's up, and we'll be moving on to our second quiz. Okay, so how would you rate your knowledge of Ontario's Emissions Performance Standard, otherwise known as the EPS, or OREG 241? So we have never heard of it, know the basics, and I'm an expert. So as we mentioned, these quizzes are going to help our presenters understand the background of all of our audience. So please feel free to answer, honestly. There's no wrong answer, and I know Emily and Bob appreciate the insight that we're getting. So looks like never heard of it and know the basics are really the predominant responses from our audience, Emily. So that gives you a good idea on the background of those involved. So I'll leave this up for another maybe 2 seconds, and then we will hop back into the presentation. And it looks like we have 22 people online, and that is the responses, Emily. So I will hand it back to you to continue on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alyssa. That's great. Okay, so the majority have never heard of it, and then a number just sort of know the basics, and then a couple experts. So for those experts, always if you want to chime in, and I'm guessing we also have, by the way, a couple of my colleagues, Michael Powell and Aditya, so who knows who the other experts are, but we'll go from there, or maybe some of your staff too, Alyssa.
Nope.
Yeah.
Emily, we do have a question come in.
Yeah, you got the wrong number.
So our first question is, why is water vapor not included in the global warming potential?
Okay, so well, first I'll just go back to this here. So, well, water vapor is not considered a greenhouse gas. So these are the sort of key greenhouse gases. So yeah, I guess that would be my answer. I don't know if, again, Michael, Bob, you would have any additional comments on that, but that would be my basic answer.
Yeah, Michael Powell here. So one of the reasons it's not included is basically the global concentrations of water vapor in the atmosphere are not sort of directly affected by human activity to the same degree as the others. And therefore, sort of human activity is kind of more, deemed an immaterial effect because of how much of it is in the atmosphere versus these other ones are very tied to human activity.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, any other questions?
No, that's everything. So thank you for the questions, and back over to you, Emily.
Perfect. Okay, I'll just skip ahead. All right. So, and you can see my screen just again, Alyssa?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so as alluded to earlier, we're going to now talk about the second regulation here under the Environmental Protection Act of Ontario, which is OREG 241-19, which is the Greenhouse Gas Emission Performance Standards. So basically, actually, before I really dive in, this is a type of emission trading system that falls under the overall sort of carbon pricing I guess, domain. And I want to get something really clear here is there's a lot of discussion politically as well, which I won't get into the politics at all, of course, but in terms of the consumer carbon pricing versus the industrial carbon pricing. And this emissions performance standard is for industry. And so just wanted to be clear that the carbon pricing that everybody is talking about, potentially being potentially removed in any kind of future election. I wanted to sort of reassure that the people on this call and industry in general that there is not really a serious any kind of discussion about removing the industrial carbon price. So if I have a crystal ball based on information that has been publicly, for example, public support from the oil and gas sector, public support from Alberta's premier for the industrial carbon price and that certainty that it provides. So just wanted to be clear that there is no indication, regardless of which government is coming in next year, of a change in industrial carbon pricing. So I do think that it's important to know about this, and there could be some tweaks on the details, but it would be expected that, and this is provincial anyways, by the way, so it wouldn't change until any provincial election. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that. So the purpose is to create a carbon pricing system that does not inhibit industrial growth by only taxing emissions over a specified limit that's unique to this facility. So that total annual emissions limit, I'll just call it the facility limit that I have mentioned, is that limit. And so basically, if you're above that limit, you only pay above and you never pay for the emissions below it. And if you're below, you actually get credits that can be monetarily, like you can earn money from selling those credits. So who has to report? If it is mandatory program, if your facility emitted over 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 1 or more years since 2014, and if your primary activity is, listed in the regulation, many industries. Then what I think is most interesting, and probably for this audience, is the voluntary participation. If you're over 10,000 but under 50,000, and we saw from the other regulation that, again, the majority of this audience is over 10,000, and I'm guessing under 50,000. So I would say a lot of you, if you're in the industrial sector, would fit into this voluntary. You can choose, and I would very strongly encourage you, if you haven't already, do the math to determine, is it better for you to register for the emissions performance standard, or is it better to continue paying the federal fuel charge? Because registered facilities within the EPS are exempt from the federal fuel charge to avoid double taxation. So we have found with our clients that I would say in most of the cases, it is actually advantageous to them to voluntarily opt in to the emissions performance standard and avoid paying the federal fuel charge. So the federal fuel charge is basically the carbon price on, say, for example, diesel that's used at a facility. So for consumers, we're paying the federal fuel charge through the distributors. So like the fuel producers and distributors are having to pay that price, and then it gets kind of flowed through. They kind of increase the prices at the pumps, et cetera, except if you have an electric car and then you don't go to the pump very often or at all. So then that federal fuel charge is, again, that sort of carbon price. And the coverage for this emissions performance standard is industry and power generation. So this is a bit newer. It came into effect in January 2022. For those of you who are a bit lost in terms of these regulations, you're not alone. There's a lot of people who are extremely frustrated. It keeps consultants in business. So what can I say? No, but anyways, yeah, the Ontario sort of domain of greenhouse gases has been very, unfortunately, in my opinion, changed way too frequently, right? So we started in Ontario, I believe it was in 2018, with the cap and trade program that was very short-lived with the change in government that then removed that and put in the federal, what's called the federal backstop, which is the federal carbon price, and it was for industry, the Ontario-based output-based pricing system. And now that, as of January 22nd, has been removed and replaced with this sort of Ontario-specific emissions performance program. So hoping that this will stay for a while and have certainty, because that's what I think all of you likely want, to have some certainty for your investments. So the requirements of the EPS basically say that you actually use the quantification methods of that previous regulation 390 that we just discussed to determine your facility emissions. So it has the same materiality and boundaries. So that's very good. These two regulations are very linked. And recall that TAEL is the total annual emissions limit. So again, if you emit more, then you have a compliance obligation, meaning dollars that you have to pay. So whatever the compliance obligation is, your your limit minus what you actually emitted. So if you actually emitted more than your limit, then you're going to have this compliance obligation. If you emit less, then you receive credits called emission performance units. And these emission performance units are, again, that difference between what you actually emitted and your limit. So for compliance, say you have to pay. So if you have to pay, well, how do you do it? You can purchase excess emission units from the Ontario government, and they are set right now to align with the federal carbon pricing. So that means $80 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2024, rising by $15 every year, up to $170 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030. So you could pay the Ontario government. You could use your banked emissions performance units from previous years. So if in a previous year you were under the limit, you can bank that and then use it, say, for example, this year. Or thirdly, you could purchase or trade emissions performance units from other people, other companies in the EPS program. So we have clients, for example, who have 2 facilities in Ontario. One of them was above their limit, one of them was below. They were able to trade, and that worked out very well. So the basic calculation that you're looking at to determine your limit is your emissions intensity. So that would be like your tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per production, whether that's, tons of steel or ounces of gold or whatever, times the production of your facility, and then times the stringency factor. I see you, Alyssa, have come on. I'm guessing there might be a question, so I'll just finish here, this slide, and then we'll go to the question. So your stringency factor is essentially a percentage between 0 and 1 that is related to the goal is to try and improve industry's performance over time. So what that means is that at the beginning, the first year, which was 2022, your limit was higher than it would be each year. So each year, your stringency factor goes from, say, for example, 90% to 88 to 86, etc., and it reduces. So you have to perform better each year. Otherwise, you'll be paying more or, getting less credits. And you have to calculate your own total annual emissions limit. The government does not do that for you. And there's this methodology. Be careful. Hopefully you have used the March 2024 version. If not, you might need to do some revisions for that. And it's not possible to trade emission performance units outside Ontario. So the Ontario emissions performance standard is not linked to other systems, and you can bank for up to 5 years your emission performance units. So in your corporate strategy, you want to think about that. Keep in mind that the cost is going up, right? So they'll actually be worth more in the future. Borrowing is not allowed. And the use of offset credits is not allowed as a compliance options. Initially, Ontario may change that in the future. And just lastly here, CCS, carbon capture and storage, is eligible. Just wanted to mention that. And I think that is all for now. Yeah, I'll take a question, Alyssa.
Yeah, Emily, I heard you mention multiple facilities, and we did have a question come up from a participant. Edward says, we own multiple facilities. Do we need to report emissions individually or aggregated? And he talks about under OREG 390. So maybe you can address that and whether it's the same for both regulations.
Yeah, and Bob, I'll invite you to jump in a sec. My understanding is that you have to submit for each facility separately, and that it would apply to both regulations. Bob, would you like to comment at all on that?
Yeah, the definition of what a facility is there is some flexibility in terms of facilities that are within a campus or adjacent facilities, but for the most part, you're looking at each individual site is a facility that needs to assess whether it needs to report or not, and so if you've got 100 say retirement homes around the province, it's unlikely any one of those is going to be large enough on its own, but in an aggregate, yes, certainly it would be very large, but because you're just doing it at a facility level, they would be below the limit in most cases.
Great, thanks, guys. One other question, Emily, before we move on. Actually, we have 2 questions from Alan Sutton. Hi, Alan. So his first question is related to the impact of magnitude of the stringency factor. So maybe we can address that one, and then we have a part 2 to Alan's question as well.
Sure. Actually, there is a slide on the stringency factor in like maybe 2 or 3 slides, and we'll just see the exact numbers. So maybe I can just answer that at that point if that works.
Perfect. Thanks, Emily. And another question from Alan that refers to a slide a couple slides ago. For RNG, what range of emission factors are acceptable? Less than 0.001921 ton CO2 per cubic meter down to negative, and then he has anaerobic digestion in brackets. And
yeah,
do we need more elaboration, or are we good on that question? Because we can invite Alan to come on if we need him to elaborate.
Yeah, no, I understand the question in terms of the limits, but I don't have that answer off the top of my head in terms of the exact numbers. I'm guessing none of my colleagues would either, unless Bob. I'm guessing that sort of extreme number detail would not be available. Bob, any additional thoughts from you, or?
Sorry, no, I don't have anything else on that.
Yeah. So what I would say is we could potentially get that for Alan. But yeah, that sort of level of detail is beyond this the scope, I would say, of this relatively high level course. But yeah, I'll get to the stringency factor though, Alan, in a couple slides. Thank you, Alyssa. Anything else at this time?
Thanks.
Or okay.
Nope, that's everything.
Great. Okay, so just before moving on, I wanted to also talk about enforcement or a penalty from the government if you do not comply with if you have a compliance obligation and must pay. If you do not, so you have to comply by ensuring that you have enough basically in your account by the 15th of December of the following year. And if you don't, then you have to pay 3 times the amount by February 15th in the years that's like 2 years after the compliance. So it is a pretty steep penalty. Whatever you owe, it's 3 times that is the penalty. So definitely want to ensure that you're paying on time. So I'm not going to go into the details of the different methodologies. As you can see here, there are 7 different methodologies for calculating your total annual emissions limit. What I would say is that if you're unsure which method to use, it would be best to contact the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks directly, and they should be able to guide you on which one is applicable for your facility. And because there are, some significant differences, and if you do have a choice, which may be the case, you might want to lobby to the government and explain your case. We have seen, with some clients that they're more advantageous under certain methodologies than others, and I believe in the steel sector, for example, in those amendments, there's been some updates as well. Presumably, I'm guessing the steel sector lobbied for some changes given that all of the investments they're making in the electric arc furnaces. So, but basically, high level, how is this emission level set? It's either set from a facility specific, so based on your specific facility, it could be based on the sector or historical emissions. So there can be, I'll give a mining example that can be quite different. So in some other provincial jurisdictions, all of mining has the same kind of performance, like standard in terms of per whatever ton of commodity, let's say ton of copper, whatever it is. Whereas you can have sort of a difference between open pit versus underground. And so open pit is much more emissions intensive than underground. And so that can make a big difference and sort of penalize, shall we say, the open pit potentially. You could also look at it as if you have one, it's actually helping the planet more because we need to do absolute reduction. But anyways, there's some nuances that are, potentially multi-million-dollar questions. Again, kind of beyond the scope of this info session to go into the details of any of the calculations of any of these methodologies, but just know that they are there. And if you have a choice, then it might be worth, talking to the government about that. Okay, so this is a slide on the stringency factors. So as I mentioned, verification is required, and this is the the graph here on the left is the carbon price. So now at $80 per ton carbon dioxide equivalent, these are Canadian dollars. And this is the stringency factor. So the stringency factor this year is at about 88% and going to approximately 79%. So you can see that that's like a 9% difference. So to answer your question, Alan, I mean, you can model that basically by, and consultants, we can always help, of course, you know, creating, if you don't have them already, your greenhouse gas projections out to 2030, and that total emissions, annual emissions limit, looking at your, you know, production, and adding in that stringency factor decrease here, and that'll help. Basically, it should answer your question, but you kind of have to do the math to for your specific case to see how that directly impacts you. But hopefully that answered your question. And for those who aren't aware, if I've mentioned the federal backstop carbon price, that's basically a price on carbon to which the provinces must at a minimum match their own carbon pricing plans, or they're subject to that price. So Ontario had to make some adjustments, such as the addition of the stringency factor to align with the federal what's called output-based pricing system. That's the federal backstop, where provincial or territorial jurisdictions that do not have an approved federally approved carbon pricing program have to use that backstop basically. Okay, and last couple slides on this regulation. So these are some of the obligations you have to do monthly filing with the Canadian Revenue Agency, the annual GHG report we've talked about by June 1st, the third-party verification by September 1st, these are of the following year, of course, and then your compliance payment, as I mentioned, by December 15th. And just to wrap that section up, they also have made amendments to the 241. They're basically the slide I presented previously on OREG 390 amendments. Basically, I would say they're kind of like all together. So again, some of the examples are changing the terminology of some of the production parameters, assigning and revoking baseline emission intensities. So your baseline emission intensity is kind of related to you know, whether you're above or below the line, so it's quite an important aspect. So I'll pause there before moving on to the Electricity Act. Any questions at this time, Melissa?
We just had one come in again from Alan. Alan says, for an industrial application, what if consumption is weakly correlated to production level, but very heavily coordinated to OATB weather? I.e., how does the situation affect the reporting?
Okay, so if I understand Alan's question is a situation where the energy and therefore emissions are correlated mostly with weather and not necessarily with production. I think that's
yes, so, and he says, he clarifies OAT. I'm not familiar with OAT.
Outside air temperature.
Outside air temperature.
Yeah, there we go.
Yes, so Alan, I have not seen in the regulations a provision for that. We've seen the sort of production. My advice, and again, I'll let Bob, you jump in, would be that this is maybe something that you want to, again, sort of advocate, try and find if there's an automotive, I'm sure there's automotive industry association, get them to perhaps lobby on behalf of the Automotive Industry Association and to see if that can be amended. Bob, have you seen any?
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with an example for this reporting system. Certainly there are facilities that are quite heavily influenced by air temperatures and demands on HVAC or especially drying processes with humidity. I guess yeah, I don't have any examples of running it through the calculations. I guess I just also want to make a comment just to give an idea of context. So there's about currently about 300 facilities in Ontario that are over that do have to report, that are over 10,000 tons per year, and there's only about 100 that are large enough that are over 50,000. So there's 100 facilities that must participate in EPS, and then there's others of those other remaining 200. There are some that may participate where it's voluntary. So that's sort of the context of the number of facilities in Ontario that these regulations apply to.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that context, Bob. Any other questions, Alyssa, on OREG 241?
Oh, just as I'm shaking my head. Oh, Alan says got it. Thank you. No, so no other questions at this time, Emily.
Perfect. Okay, so we've covered the two major Ontario energy and GHG regulations under the Environmental Protection Act. And now we're going to briefly, much shorter sort of time frame, discuss two regulations under the Electricity Act that's supervised by the way, this ministry name has just recently changed. It used to be, I believe, just Ministry of Energy. Now it's Ministry of Energy and Electrification. So the two regulations we'll be talking about will be the clean energy credits and reporting of energy consumption and water use. So the purpose of the Electricity Act is to ensure an adequate, safe, sustainable, and reliable supply of electricity by responsibly planning and managing electricity resources, supply, and demand. So the ISO, who is the I guess sponsor of this whole series, and that the Canadian Institute for Energy Training is running all this capability building plan under, and that this training falls under. Basically, the ISO is responsible for executing this. So the Electricity Act says that the government needs to do this, and they have sort of basically ensured that the ISO is doing that. Monica, if I speak anything incorrectly, let me know, as we have an ISO representative here. But then also the ISO does have, as Monica mentioned, electricity conservation and energy efficiency, basically programs, and is meant to encourage that as well, promote use of cleaner energy sources and technologies, provide non-discriminatory access to transmission distribution. So up in Northern Ontario, there's, the need for more, as well as in some, there's been some significant build out in some of the Southern Ontario with like the greenhouse and vegetable growing, et cetera, areas, Leamington, et cetera. So significant transmission distribution requirements, and it's supposed to be non-discriminatory, so that's quite important, and protecting interests of consumers, prices, adequacy, reliability, or quality. I would say that some consumers, such as myself, greatly value sustainability as well, but that's also mentioned up here, and hopefully many of you as well. Okay, so first one, and we just have a couple of slides on this, and we'll get actually to the clean, let's do the Menti then right now before we dive into the clean energy credits. Alyssa, I'll stop sharing.
Sure. Okay, so here we go. So back to Menti again. Join menti.com, use code 83376383. We'll switch over to our next question, which is your organization's participation in Ontario's clean energy credits. So the answers and options are: we have procured credits, don't know, plan to procure credits in the future, and the fourth option is no intention to procure credits. So, as we see, we're getting a lot of don't knows, and I think that that's a good sign for us, Emily, and the content that we'll be providing. So just as a little aside, there'll be a separate training session in the fall on clean energy credits. We don't have a date set for that one yet, but pay attention to the upcoming webinars through training and support, the Save on Energy website, and we'll give you some links to those resources later. But yeah, there'll be definitely some more training coming up in that regard. So Emily, looks like most people answering the quiz really don't know.
Perfect. Okay, great. Yeah, that's really happy about this. Menti is really helping. And one has, I just see just came in, have procured credits. So this also speaks to the newness of the program. So let me just go back and again, just doing a check. Alyssa, you can see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So the clean energy credits is regulation 39-23. So again, you can see it was just enacted and actually December 27th, 2023. So really just under 6 months ago. So this is run through the ISO registry, and basically the purpose is to have an electronic certificate tracking system that demonstrates when clean energy from Ontario-based generation has been acquired to meet a voluntary, I would say, like greenhouse gas reduction target. So this is essentially Ontario, and how they define clean is that it has to be generated from transmission and distribution connected assets from biofuel, from biogas, biomass, hydro, nuclear, solar, or wind. So nuclear is often a question, you know, is that qualify as clean? And the government has defined it as so. I would say that if they could not call this a green because there's some concerns potentially, but I think you can consider nuclear clean because it's not producing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the definition. So if you have a clean electricity supply, basically in Ontario, then they can generate a credit, which is representing, be careful, the credits are not based on tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, as is, you know, the case for carbon credits. In this case, a credit is representing 1 megawatt hour generated in Ontario. This is only Ontario and is not, you know, for any international kind of trading or anything like that, at least not currently. So it has to be exclusively purchased and claimed or retired by a load customer. That means all of you basically who are consuming power, no generators within Ontario. So essentially, the purpose here is the government's going to get some revenue. That's why it's good for the government, and they're claiming it's good for Ontario, and I think it will be eventually good in terms of to basically kind of encourage more clean electricity. I would say there is one major issue currently, and I have discussed this with Senior Ontario bureaucrat. And the problem is currently the ISO is not yet publishing residual grid emission factors, and that is to avoid double counting. It's very important. In Europe, they're doing that. So I have been assured this is in the works, but I think there is some concern initially that there could be some double counting, because if you don't have a residual grid emission factor published, what's happening is essentially, if you think about it, if you think, for example, Microsoft, they are essentially, if for example, they're procuring clean hydro or nuclear power from Ontario Power Generation in Ontario, and say they get, X credits, 100 credits, whatever it is, then if they do that, they get 100%, clean electricity that they can claim on their sustainability report. However, what happens for the rest of Ontario electricity users? Our electricity has now got dirtier, right? And so we need to have the residual grid emission factors, that really key value that essentially makes that dirtier. We've seen this because we track this, kind of globally when we are looking at different jurisdictions. We've seen that in Germany. Michael can elaborate to others. I think maybe also England, etc., where actually as the time has gone on, the residual grid emission factor gets more dirty as more of these sort of their power purchase agreements, essentially to contract for clean electricity, means that some companies are basically getting 100% electricity that's clean or green, and the leftover, if you're not doing that, then your electricity and the environmental attributes associated with it, so that's like how many tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per megawatt hour is in your electricity, is actually getting dirtier. So just I would say stay tuned for that, and this is a program that I'm hoping, again, that residual grid emission factor will be implemented very soon to avoid the double counting. And in terms of requirements, eligible generators and loads participating in the sale and purchase of these clean energy credits are to register with the Midwest Renewable Energy Tracking System that basically creates, transfers, and retires them. So you can also enlist a broker or independently sell and purchase clean energy credits. And again, the ISO clean energy credits, they originate from these environmental attributes associated with this clean generation produced with under contract with the ISO. That's why you have to be like transmission or distribution connected. And there's one broker here, Carbone Inc., that you can are available for purchase there. So I think, again, this is a new program that I think will be quite useful going forward, but it's still in its infancy. Any questions on that? We're just doing a high level, as Alyssa said. There'll be a more in-depth training, including also on power purchase agreements in the fall.
Nope, no questions from everybody, Emily. So I see time-wise, we probably, we'll probably stop a little less for questions just to help you get through it, and we'll pick them up at the end.
Sounds good. Okay, so the last Ontario regulation here is the OREG 506, reporting of energy consumption and water use. And its purpose basically is energy and water benchmarking and reporting. So for those of you in the MUSH sector, I know there's a number of you, I'm sure you're actually probably very familiar. This is an older regulation, so it's back to 2018. Hence, we're also not going to spend too much time on it because we think that the majority of you understand it and are, reporting every year now for 6 years. So owners of buildings with gross floor area of over 50,000 square foot have to report by July 1st. So that's actually, again, your heads up. Essentially, if you don't want to be working on the Canada Day long weekend, you need to get it in day after tomorrow. So if you haven't, then I know what you'll be doing in the next 48 hours. So the requirements are owners report data to the Ministry of Energy and Electrification using the Energy Star Portfolio Manager. We have some links here. CIET meaning the Canadian Institute for Energy Training, offers several courses for Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And they also have a few webinars. I think maybe Alyssa might be able to put some of those webinar links in the chat. And also just be aware some municipalities have some parallel reporting requirements. Okay, so that is wrapping up the Ontario regulations. That was the largest component. Now we will talk about just a couple federal regulations and reporting. So specifically the clean fuel regulations and the greenhouse gas reporting program. So the clean fuel regulations, you may not think this applies to you, but just bear with me. We'll run through it pretty quickly. It's probably maybe a little less relevant, but there could be a lot of potential funds available for you or opportunity to essentially make money for your organization if you are in the ability to do some energy charging sort of electrification. So we'll get into that. So mainly it's requiring liquid fossil fuel primary suppliers to reduce the life cycle carbon intensity of the gasoline and diesel that they produce and sell for use in Canada. So this is mainly about liquid fossil fuel primary suppliers, of which, most of you in the audience are not that, but just we'll see they have to do compliance payments as well. And there is an opportunity for those not in the fossil fuel supply to actually provide credits that the fossil fuel, liquid fossil fuel suppliers could purchase from you, essentially. So the carbon intensity, CI, is measured in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. And the target is a 15% reduction by 2030 compared to the 2016 levels. This is a pretty new regulation just enacted about a year ago. So I'm going to kind of jump over this slide pretty quickly, but this just shows the carbon intensity over time going down for both gasoline and diesel. So the requirements, and number 3 is where it gets interesting for you. So these producers and importers of gasoline and diesel, they have to create or buy credits to comply with the reduction requirements, kind of similar to the emission performance standard that we talked about previously. So they can, extra credits, they can bank or sell them. So they can create compliance credits in 3 ways: by essentially reducing the life cycle carbon intensity of their fossil fuels, or supplying low carbon intensity fuels like ethanol or biodiesel. But where it gets interesting for you is this end-use fuel switching in transportation. So other industrial companies, I think it doesn't even have to be industrial, to be honest. We can double check on that. But other companies that are not, liquid fossil fuel producers can register to create compliance credits through vehicle electrification and electrical vehicle charging. And they can be sold at high prices. So, we have a maximum price of $300 per credit for the clearance mechanism adjusted for inflation. And we have, some clients that in sort of other, have other mechanisms. It could even go beyond that. So as I mentioned, the current carbon price is $80. So if we're looking at, multiple hundred, 300, this could be extremely lucrative opportunity. And this is why we wanted to kind of just raise this in this information session, that some participants, probably a small subset, but it could be, again, very lucrative for you. So might want to consider that. Okay, and now the second greenhouse gas, this is not really regulation, it's a program, but under regulation is the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program federally, known as the GHGRP for reporting program. So it's mandatory, and ECCC, the Environment Climate Change Canada, insists that facilities that emit 10 kilotons or more per year have to comply. So again, we saw earlier that many of you emit more than 10 kilotons, and you have to provide additional data if you're in a subset of any of these industries. So this is an old program, 2004, 20 years old. So hopefully many of you are more familiar with this one. So basically it includes, again, all of the greenhouse gases, and it's collected under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So the SWIM system that we talked about earlier, same system as for Ontario, is used for reporting, and you can again submit both your federal and Ontario report together under that system. The deadline, again, you hopefully have submitted June 3rd. And about 1,800 facilities currently report within Canada. There's some nice new dashboards that show the location based on this GHGRP graphically of all the facilities, and have like circles for bigger facilities. And so I don't have that link with me right now, but know that it exists out there, and could be potentially just interesting for you to see. The boundaries are, again, basically mostly scope 1, but also if you generate electricity in the facility used on site or sold, you also have to report that. But if you're purchasing electricity, that's scope 2. You do not need to report that. So it's basically, again, scope 1. And this slide shows, again, all the kind of gases, and it shows the different emission source categories, from whether it's like on-site transportation to waste or wastewater, if it's fugitive emissions, et cetera. And it kind of gives you a nice chart of whether, you do not have to report it, if you have to report it, or if there's some detail on reporting by gas that's required. Okay. And then in terms of amendments, since 2022, the ECCC does not allow upload of the Ontario facility GHG reports in lieu of completing the federal. However, they have kind of done some harmonization. So there's an option, hopefully you've all seen it, called ECCC and on Ontario, and you click on that option and can fill in your report through there. So again, Ontario submission does not cut it anymore for the federal, but you do this one together and you're all good. Okay, and just before finalizing the federal, we just wanted to touch again on that federal fuel charge for Ontario facilities. So the federal fuel charge is governed by the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, and this is collected by distributors. This is kind of the I would say the consumer carbon pricing, basically, that we've been talking about. What's most important is that, again, it's refunded to eligible participants in the Ontario EPS program. So you get any costs in the federal fuel charge refunded back to you if you're registered in the EPS.
Oh, sorry, if I could just jump in on that last point. So it's depending on where you read this, it's either they say refunded or you are exempt. You can enroll in the EPS, and then you are exempt from. I believe you do not pay the taxes up front and then have to be refunded, you are exempt from being charged the tax. I've seen two different interpretations of that.
Perfect. Thank you, Bob, for that clarification. And lastly here on the federal part is the federal fuel charges for Ontario facilities. So this just shows the carbon price, which again, you're probably starting to get familiar with. It started back, by the way, in 2019. Seems to have gone very fast. Time flies, I guess, right? We're already at $80 now. And this is the specific impact for natural gas, marketable natural gas, from the federal carbon charge in a cents per meter cubed going forward here. And I just took my personal bill because I was interesting. I thought this just might be interesting for you. So we're saying in 2024, 15 cents per meter cubed. And so this is basically, yeah, the carbon price that's being added to the Enbridge bills or the federal fuel charge. So from a residential perspective, on a summer, like, you know, spring where not much natural gas was used, I had $5 on our bill that was related to this for the house heating. We have a home heat pump, but we also still have some residual natural gas. Anyways, so $5 out of a $38 bill for 35 meters squared. So it did compute to the 15 cents. So my bill computed with that, and other parts of the bill were related to supply were about $7 and a customer charge of 25. So just to give you an order of magnitude, like when you're not consuming a lot of gas, and yeah, the carbon price was actually significant, which is good. You know, we need to get more, again, heat pumps, etc. And yeah, so that's I think just wanting to flag that to everybody's attention. Okay, so the last section is on financial reporting. And just before we dive into that, we're going to go to our last Menti, Alyssa. Unless there are any questions, or you said maybe take them at the end.
No questions. So your slide's been very clear, Emily. I'm going to share the last Menti. All right. So the last question we have is regarding your organization's climate disclosure. And the options are, so if you click closer to the left, you strongly disagree, and if you click closer to the right, strongly agree. So your organization, the first question, follows the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. The second question is plans to follow the Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards. 2. And the third question is includes decarbonization budget allocation. And the fourth is includes a decarbonization transition plan. So if your organization does any or all of those, please feel free to select on the scroll bar. Closer to the left again means strongly disagree. Closer to the right means strongly agree. And you can see that we're already getting some responses in. So I think we had about 20 people on last time. Again, if you've logged off, you can join us on menti.com, use code 83376383. I know we're running short on time, so we will maybe cut this one a little bit shorter. I know this one takes a little bit longer to answer, but yeah, overwhelmingly, we're getting more responses towards strongly agree on includes a decarbonization transition plan. So that's always good to see. And we have you know, a few that are including decarbonization in their budget allocation. Again, that only helps to bolster your transition plan. And you know, some in the middle for plans to follow the Canadian Sustainability Disclosure and the TCFD. So good that we're going to be covering that in the upcoming slides. Emily, do you get any more thoughts from those responses?
Yeah, thank you, Alyssa. I think you've covered the key points. It's interesting that yeah, I mean, TCFD and the Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards are more comprehensive and require a lot more than decarbonization budget and decarbonization transition plans are two specific elements of actually both. So it just pulled those specifically out so we can see that there, you know, it kind of makes sense. There are a bit more people who have those specific aspects, which I would argue are among the most important, but maybe not being holistically yet not following the TCFD or the Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards. So yeah, no, that's great. And I think we're good on time because we've been taking questions throughout, and we just have 3-4 more slides. So I think we're doing well. So okay, I maybe will take it back from you then, Alyssa.
Yep, sounds good. And oh, we do have one question that just came in.
Okay.
So Natalia asked, what is the best way to learn more in depth about these regulations?
That is a great question. Alyssa, there's nothing else planned for this capability building work, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, this is so this session is meant to kind of introduce and give you a high level, broad exposure to what's out there. We've seen a huge amount of participation, so that was good to see. I think anything further to that is, you know, going outside of the webinars that we'll be hosting, but you never know. Pay attention to what's coming down the road, because I know the ISO is very receptive to feedback on things that they can provide more training on. So at this point, there's nothing planned through Save on Energy, but yeah, keep an eye out. Emily, maybe there's other resources online that we can direct people to.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, and maybe again, Bob or Michael, please jump in. I mean, there's the actual regulations, but honestly, they're in legalese and really difficult to understand. But I mean, you can go to the regulations that are all linked in the documents. Yeah, Bob, I think we had some maybe resources in the slides, right?
There are, but also one place you might not have thought of looking, but there's actually some very good material. Is a lot of the law firms have posted information for their clients. That's, you know, at least they provide some of it publicly. That gives guidance. Very, very well written, you know, documents there. Some other consulting firms as well. I've even seen just at a higher level. Certainly, there's lots of international information, but specifically Ontario, I'd say the law firms actually have some very good information. There's probably at least 10 of them that I've seen just recently.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, no, that's perfect. Okay, I do want to try and end at least 5 minutes early to take any final questions. So I think I will dive into these last 3 or 4 slides. Alyssa, just making sure you can see the screen now. Or Bob?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, so to wrap up, we're going to start now with, these are voluntary currently, but be aware they're becoming mandatory in the future at a date to be determined. So we'll start with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So this has actually recently been disbanded and been folded into the International Financial Reporting Standards. Apologies for all of these acronyms. I'll try and use the full words because there's a lot of acronyms. So, but I wanted to mention TCFD is because the new standards, which from the international standards, there's now Canadian, so I've referred to the Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards. Those are Canada's answer to the international financial reporting standards. So those standards, both the international and the Canadian, are based on the TCFD. I actually call them TCFD plus. So that's why it's important, even though this has now been just recently disbanded, to go over that. So the purpose of these are essentially investors were pushing for additional transparency because climate-related risks and climate-related opportunities were not being adequately transparently disclosed from companies. And what this was leading to investors having material risks and missed material opportunities that they were unaware of that could have, of course, affect their investments. So it's the investment community that has really got behind essentially the intersection of climate and finance. And this is a pretty very important relatively new development. You can see TCFD started in 2015, so I guess it's already 9 years old now, but now we're finally getting into becoming mandatory. So the TCFD is based on 4 core elements: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So you need to have governance of climate-related risks and climate-related risks and opportunities. So at the board level and at the executive level. In terms of strategy, yes, of course, you need a climate strategy. However, you also need to integrate climate And energy efficiency, of course, is a sub-pillar within climate at all aspects of your business strategy. So, in procurement, have you considered climate? In mergers and acquisitions, have you considered climate? In all aspects, even in your training, have you considered climate? Risk management is where you're going to talk about the processes that you use to identify and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. And metrics and targets is where you talk about your greenhouse gas reduction target and your metrics and progress against your target. Here on the right is basically showing that link between climate and finance. So we're now getting to the level where we're able to help clients with their transition risks, which are, policy risks like carbon pricing, market-related risks. So if you're in the coal industry, market demand, could be going down. Although I saw actually in 2023 it wasn't globally, but in Canada perhaps. And physical risks are like floods and wildfires and those kind of things. So all of those risks, and then opportunities like, again, for market, it could be for copper, there's an increased market. So that's an opportunity. Those go into your strategic planning and risk management. And then we look at the financial impact. And we've actually done this for a number of clients where we actually take those risks and opportunities and see what the per risk and per site, how is that impacting your income, or how is that impacting your income statement in terms of revenue and expenditures? How are those climate-related risks and opportunities affecting your cash flow statement and potential future cash flow statements? And how is that impacting your balance sheet in terms of assets and liabilities, capital and financing? So really important stuff. Here, I'm just going to kind of briefly go through this. The important point here is this little green box here, that the Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards will become mandatory for publicly traded companies in Canada once they are adopted by the Canadian Securities Administrators. So just the timeline right now is the draft Canadian Disclosure Standards was just closed on June 10th. No formal date yet, but my crystal ball would say by end of year at the latest, we would have a final final voluntary standard issued by the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. And then the Canadian Securities Administrators have publicly and in writing issued their support for adopting those Canadian sustainability disclosure standards. However, from a time perspective, my guess is, they would likely not adopt those till next year, 2025, for, again, my guess, nothing firm right now for a January 1st, 2026 mandatory adoption. More to come. By the way, the US is entirely different. They're doing their own thing I won't get into this now, but they are not doing this, but many of the rest of the world is internationally. Okay, and last content slide here is just about what the requirements are. So just keep in mind they're monetary units now. Again, we're talking about finance, dollars, not tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. It is only single materiality, meaning this is the impact of climate on the company, not the company's impact on the climate. That would be a double materiality that's in Europe. By the way, if any of you have European operations, then that's a whole other ballgame. They're way ahead, and we can talk maybe one-on-one of that. Likely assurance will be required in the future, although right now it's silent on assurance, and probably not in the first iteration, but maybe in the future. Higher level of detail is required in these new Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards, which again are actually the same as the international with just a couple tweaks of dates. But by the way, the international and the Canadian are identical. So you're going to have to, unless it's pulled from, these are the draft so far, so it could change. But right now, scope 1, 2, and 3 will become mandatory. Transition plan, if you have one, you have to disclose it. There's a lot of those if you have it. So be careful. It's kind of somewhat surprising. If you have a GHG target that you're required to meet by law, disclose it. If you're using carbon credits to achieve your target, you have to disclose that. This is a very interesting one, the amount and percentage of assets that are vulnerable to physical and transition risks. Capital deployment for the low carbon economy, if you have an internal carbon price, and executive remuneration. So these are all what is sort of mandatory if the draft is not changed. So stay tuned. And yeah, we're done. So just to wrap up, this is from sort of CIET tools and resources. There's a live training calendar. You can sign up for the newsletter. There's a training and support webpage, and I will end it there for any final questions. And Alyssa, if you wanted to say anything further on this slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Emily, and Bob and Michael. That was very interesting and not dry whatsoever. So good job on making that content, interactive. Emily, maybe I'll get you to flip it over to the next slide, and we'll just put out those resources that you talked about. So saveonenergy.ca/training and support. We've got some links in the chat, so you can go directly to our training and support event calendar, which is constantly updated with upcoming webinars on topics like energy efficiency. There's too much to mention, so tons of upcoming webinars for you to take a look at. And if you want to just get prompted on what's coming up monthly, we also have the monthly bulletin produced by Save on Energy that comes out and kind of flags you to what's coming up in the month to come. So both of those links have been put into the chat, or you can visit the links that you see on your screen. The QR code will send you to the newsletter and events. And if you have any questions forwarding after the session, please feel free to email trainingandsupport@iso.ca. And so I see we have, it's Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl. Cheryl says, very informative presentation. Thank you. And of course, if there's any other questions, we do have 2 more minutes. I know Emily and Bob and Michael would be happy to answer any other questions that you may have. Again, we have Monica Tang, business advisor from the ISO, here with us today. So happy to direct any ISO related questions to Monica as well. Nothing coming up. So I guess, is there anything else you wanted to say, Emily?
Yeah, just one last thing. I'll just flip.
Sure.
When the participants are able to get the slides, I just want to show the index of the appendix. If you did want some more information, there will be the appendix that has the list of acronyms, legislation not covered in the information session, some of that total annual emission limit details, some GHG RP details, and some clean fuel reg details. So that's what's in the appendix, and that'll be more information. Just wanted to mention that.
I guess I just had a comment, just following up on the earlier question about where to get more information. Yeah, certainly, this is being presented via the ISO. This particular session, a lot of the material pertains to Ministry of Environment. And yeah, if the staff in those ministries are do respond to questions online, but if there are, even going through this material myself, there's a lot to know and understand, and I see there's certainly a need or a demand for seminars that go into details, perhaps, on how to complete some of these reports, especially as they evolve and change over quite frequently. So if any feedback that the ministry receives on that might help to create new training programs and seminars.
Thanks, Bob. All right. Oh, I do see we had a quick question come in. Okay, so Chris asked, where would I get more information on SF6 and transformer GHGs?
That's a good idea. Good question. I don't know if Michael, you have any additional. I mean, the global warming potential is really what you need. I would say contacting like your transmission and distribution company if they own the transformer. If you own the transformer, maybe the manufacturer. Bob or Michael, anything else to add?
Yeah, I guess just going back to my time with Toronto Hydro, I know for certainly transformers owned by Toronto Hydro, that was something they had to manage. Not really sure how it's done at a private level. It's it's really around, as far as I remember too, it's just around being monitoring of systems. They for leakage and that sort of thing. Almost kind of like you had to do with PCBs back in the day. So, but I believe certainly your local utility should be able to at least give you some direction or support on that on the documents that they use.
Yeah, and I would just add, Michael did throw in a link to a source SF6 annual emissions reporting protocol. So I understand that to be more information on the reporting of it. So thank you, Michael.
Yeah, I just want to note it is a little older, but so some of these things may have changed, such as carbon pricing or anything like that. But sort of the basis of how the emissions are calculated should largely have stayed the same.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so we are a bit over time. I don't see any other questions or comments in the chat. So I think we will close this out. Again, thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to the ISO. Really great session. And if you have any questions after the chat, again, please feel free to email trainingandsupport@iso.ca, and we'd be happy to get you some responses to those. So with that, we will finish things off and invite everybody hopefully to participate again in our future events and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you to the ISO and to SIET.